I was asked to talk about women in missions and particularly the problems around women being sort of out of sight, out of mind. That is, sisters, if you want to go over there and preach and plant churches and evangelize and do man stuff, we'll kind of look the other way as long as we get good statistics back that we can share at the annual conventions. You know, how many baptisms, how many new churches. But we're not going to put up with that stuff over here. And I wanted to share an incident that happened. My wife, Kathy, who is here, so since it happened to her, she should probably share it, but I'll go ahead and mention it in any case. And that is, while we were on a furlough one year, or as they call it now, home assignment, and we had been missionaries, I think, in Brazil for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years at that point. And the background is that in 1995, we went to Brazil as full-time missionaries with the Southern Baptist International Mission Board. And I'll mention some aspects of that as well because that's relevant to this subject. But anyway, she, as is often the case, was invited to a missions conference to speak. And I didn't happen to be at this particular one. I really don't know where I was at that time. But I remember when she came back and she related that she had spoken in this church, and I guess I gather it was a rather large church. So a lot of people, and of course, when women are given the pulpit in a Southern Baptist church as missionaries, to they're not preaching, of course, they're sharing, and they are talking about some of their experience and testimony. But after she was done, a gentleman came up to her and said, "That was really good. You're a really good preacher. It's just too bad you're a woman." And my reaction to that is, well, I'm kind of glad she is a woman. I'd be in real trouble otherwise. So, but I think in many ways that's pretty typical of the attitude in that there is a tacit recognition of the giftedness, but there's not any kind of affirmation of the possibility that you could legitimately pursue that. And I think it's really telling that the guy said, "You're a good preacher, not, you're just a good speaker." Because that kind of Freudian slip, reveals the inner witness, I would say, of a believer recognizing a gift of the Holy Spirit, but then the theological, kind of twisting or disjunction in not being able to actually affirm and say, well, yeah, this is not legitimate, just because you weren't born with the correct type of biological plumbing. And that rather crude way of putting it, I think that really highlights, to me, the absurdity of the whole thing. But this previous session that we just had really raised an interesting question. Do women exist without a man? And interestingly enough, as I was going through the material that I wanted to share today, that question didn't come up. It was only just as I was listening to the previous speaker. And it occurred to me also, does her story exist without a man? And in reviewing at least the literature on the history of missions in Brazil, the answer to that would be no. And that'll become apparent momentarily exactly how that works. But there is a real serious historical kind of amnesia that occurs when you look at a lot of the official stories about missions that have been written, and then you go back into the primary sources of those times, and you discover that in the official account, the story doesn't really exist, but in the primary sources, not only does it exist, but often it's the main story. And that really tells us something, not only about attitude, but also it raises questions in terms of missiology about what do we do going forward, and particularly now Kathy and I are involved in a mission agency whose primary focus is theological education overseas in a number of different countries. And we have a number of young women, several young women who are in the final stages or have just completed a doctoral program and who are on their way to the field. And the question becomes, how do we best support them so that they become most successful? And there are issues around that as well. Kathy works in member care with our mission agency right now, and one of our primary concerns, and we've seen this throughout our own missionary career, is how do you deal with the attrition rate and set up young missionaries in such a way that they can go out for the long haul and that they're not going to become casualties of all of the stress and difficulties that are there. And for women, you have a whole additional layer of that stress because it involves whether or not your ministry is even legitimate and what kind of support structure you need, as opposed to pressure that may be there for why are you here in the first place, and how to surmount that. So, do women exist without a man, and does her story exist without a man? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about just our personal experience before I get into some specific historical material. And that is, I first got involved in missions as a college student when I went over to India as part of a summer program, again with Southern Baptist. And one of the things that I noticed there was women missionaries typically come in two varieties, which you don't see so much among men, and that is single and married. And what I mean by that is that I can't recall any single male missionary that I've ever met. I've heard of them, and I'm sure they exist here and there, but honestly, I can't think of a single one. Whereas when I got to India, one of the things that was striking was one of the most prominent missionaries there was a woman who was a surgeon. And the mission had established a hospital there as kind of a focal point for evangelism and for social work and those kinds of things. But this was interesting to me and sort of tucked in the back of my mind. When we got to Brazil, I noticed again, and I can think of, I've got a list here of about 5 different women. There are more than this. One who was a seminary president, another who was the director of what at the time was a women's institute for learning, more like a Bible college, or a seminary for women. And of course, in Brazil, seminary is a bachelor's level program, so it's more like a Bible college in the first place. Another who was also a seminary professor who taught both in the seminary, which originally was founded just for men, but by the time we got there, was co-ed. And then she also taught in the Women's Bible Institute, and was very active as personally as an evangelist and discipling, and also did a lot of administrative work. I can think of another one who was quite involved as a teacher and administrator. And then one other woman that became friends with us, who was a seminary professor in the seminary, had a department of sacred music, and she was also a worship leader and specialist, but really training a generation of missionaries in music and worship, and also participated in church planting team. And then the Southern Baptist, at the time, I assume this program still exists, had a 2-year program for recent college graduates called Journeyman Program. Like, interesting, called Journeyman, but I never saw any men that were in it at all. It was always women, and typically they were teachers for the missionary kids or other things like that. In ministries that basically would free missionaries up to be able to concentrate, and particularly freeing up female missionaries who were married to be able to concentrate on ministry. Now, the second category of female missionaries and women missionaries would be married women. And an interesting thing about that, and again, I'm speaking of Southern Baptist, and I can't speak for how every other mission agency works, but it was interesting that if you're a woman and you were married, then your official assignment was church and home. And the men were always the ones who had the official job title. You were a church planter, you were an administrator, or you were an evangelist, or you were a seminary teacher, or whatever. Now, it's not that married women didn't do all of those things. They often did, but they never had that as a title. And the other interesting thing is that the missionary salary was always 100% in the name of the man. Now, the idea behind that was that if you do that, you actually wind up getting a bigger Social Security payout in retirement. Well, that says something about our government system, I guess. But in any case, the expectation was that women would take care of the home. But in the mission culture on the field, and you can tell me if I'm right, but I thought it was rare to find a woman who was only doing that. Most were quite actively involved in other outside ministries. And again, a wide variety of ministries. Bible studies, discipleship, magazine editing, seminary teaching, church planting teams, administration, evangelism, just a wide variety and oftentimes to the point that it overshadowed, I think, the husband's official ministry. I can think of one good friend of ours who was a coordinator for volunteer teams that would come to the field. And the woman was amazing. I mean, she would organize these teams, medical teams often, that would go up into the slums in Rio and just have an amazing impact. And churches were planted out of that. And I can't even remember what it was her husband did, actually, but he was, I know he was active. You know who I'm talking about. Anyway, the force of women being involved, and married women as well, is a very prominent reality. Now, what's interesting here, and one of the things that we learned about, and I've done some background reading, the first two Baptist missionaries, or Southern Baptist missionaries that went to Brazil who actually stuck, that is, who were successful in 1881, William Buck Bagby and his wife Anne. And they're kind of legends in Brazilian Baptist life. planted the first Baptist church in 1882. In 1901, they moved to Sao Paulo, and it's interesting that in looking at the history, Ann Bagby organized and operated a school which was and still exists today, the Colegio Batista, and it's on the same campus or right next to the Baptist Seminary in Sao Paulo. But this was one of the first well-organized and most successful schools that was organized for teaching children. I started off as a school for girls. And the interesting thing about it is that in doing this work, one of the things that she said about it was that she felt like that starting a school would allow her to have a sphere of influence equal to, or maybe even superior to, the men who were preaching, and noting that preaching was exclusive to men at the time. And it did turn out to be very influential. But I think as we look at that history and we see that this was a pivotal key role, nevertheless, the accounts really do focus on the men. And I wanted to share with you some reading that I've done, and I'm going to talk some about the Assemblies of God. And a little context for that is currently I teach in a master's program at a Baptist college in Curitiba, which is in South Brazil. I would say probably about half of my students are from the Assemblies of God. And there's a large movement of Pentecostals who are seeking theological education, and we're involved in training them. So I have a lot of contact with the Assemblies. And also, there are a lot of women from the Assemblies who I've had in class, and they are functioning in pastoral roles now officially, which is quite a change from the history. The Assemblies of God were founded in Brazil shortly after the Azusa Street revivals in the early 1900s here, where the Pentecostal movement got started. There were two Swedish missionaries and their wives who were involved, who had come to the United States and were involved getting education and also doing ministry, but they felt a call to go to Brazil. And you have to admire these guys because they couldn't really find anybody to send them there, so they just got on a boat with about $100 in their pockets and went and didn't speak the language or anything. Landed up in North Brazil, which is significant because all other missionary work, Protestant work, had started in the far south. Now, Brazil is as large as the continental United States. Most people don't get that picture. A lot of people will ask us, "Oh, you work in Brazil? Do you know so and so?" And we're like, "Well." Although every once in a while it turns out that we actually do. But that's another story. But it's a huge country, and they started up in the north. And Gunnar and Frida Wingren, Swedish couple, had spent time in the United States and arrived in Brazil. And Gunnar Wingren is revered as being one of the founders of the Assemblies of God in Brazil. Now, it's very typical to a lot of Pentecostal history in the United States in that they went there to work with Presbyterians. As soon as the Presbyterians found out these guys were, speaking in tongues and had a bigger vision of the Holy Spirit, they were booted out. And so they found themselves on their own and continued doing evangelism, and then they had to organize these new believers into churches. What's interesting, this particular writer that I'm referring to, and this is, I want to give credit for this so that I'm not accused of plagiarism, Gideon Freire de Alencar, who is a Brazilian writer, and this is actually his doctoral dissertation, which he did at the Catholic University in Sao Paulo, which has been then revised and as they do with dissertations, and then published. And sharing this with you, I think, is significant because I don't think this exists in English, so it's only in Portuguese. So you probably won't have access to this unless you read Portuguese, which all of you should do, actually. It should be required. But in any case, if you read Spanish, you can probably wade through it as well. But he writes in this book that in doing his research, and he is an evangelical part of who grew up in this movement, that he grew up hearing all of the official history and how Gunnar Wingren is practically canonized as one of the, he's the Martin Luther of Pentecostals, of Assemblies of God in Brazil. Well, what's interesting, he said, is that you don't see anything in the official history, whether oral or written, about his wife, Frida, except the fact that she existed and maybe a mention of one or two things that she might have done. But he started getting to the primary sources and discovered, first of all, that Gunnar, even though he did a lot of remarkable missionary work, was in fact always in bad health, to the extent that Frida carried much of the load, and besides, of course, having several children to care for. And much of the work that she did involved direct, firsthand church planting, preaching, evangelization in both personal as well as in crusade kinds of environments, or I guess revival, open air preaching. And more significantly, she organized, founded, and was the editor of a prominent magazine which was published in the 1910s, 20s, and I'm not sure how much it continued after her death in around in the early 30s. I was assuming that it did, but she was very well known, and not just simply for editing, but writing a lot of the material, which was widely used in Bible study groups across the Assemblies of God movement. Now, the Assemblies of God in Brazil has exploded to the point that they, for several decades now, have been the largest evangelical denomination in the country. Honestly, you can go into small villages where there's no Catholic church, which is amazing in Brazil, to find a place where there's no Catholic church, but you'll find a little building somewhere that says Assembleia de Deus, Assemblies of God. They're everywhere, and they're so ubiquitous that it's just amazing to think of the numbers and the success of the movement. And there are a lot of reasons why this appeals to Brazilians culturally. But it's interesting that much of the early theology of the movement and the discipleship and Bible study, the materials were developed by Frida and some of the women that worked with her in the magazine. Now, the writer of this dissertation notes that in theory, in Pentecostal theology, there's equality between men and women for the simple reason that the Holy Spirit acts the same way regardless of gender. But he says in the practice of ecclesiology, or in the church, it's a different thing altogether. And then he says something that really struck me because of Mimi's research and some of the presentations and things that she's written, in pointing out that this seems to be kind of a typical trend, and that is new movements of the church, new movements of the Holy Spirit often have a very heavy presence of women who are either founders or catalysts in leading and making things happen and getting things going. And the writer of this dissertation says, this is what happened, that the best opportunities that women had among the assemblies of God were the first decades. And after the initial, let's say, 30 years, you begin to get an institutionalization process. So it's like, the women do all this stuff and get it up and running and going smooth, and then the guys move in and take it over. Now, I've said to my wife a number of times, and I really admire in the animal kingdom is the lion. Because the dude lays around all day and does nothing, and the woman takes care of the kids and goes out and does all the hunting and work and brings it home. And then when she brings it home, he gets up and knocks her out of the way and just eats it, and then he goes and lays back down. And obviously I'm joking, because I wouldn't last 10 seconds if I really believed that. But, as I was reading some of this material, that image came into my mind. And again, I'm not saying that the men weren't doing anything. I mean, they were doing a lot of significant work. It's just that for some reason, there seems to be this pattern over and over again, and it's replicated on the mission field. And I think it's one of the reasons why that in mission work, women who really want to have lots of opportunities get involved in pioneer work and get involved in doing new things. And I would say, as a matter of pragmatism, that if you want to encourage women to really have a lot of opportunities, you encourage them in that direction. Not because that's correct or just or biblical, but just pragmatically, that's where they're going to have more freedom. And then, you can maybe do some work with the men to get them to, I would say most guys are kind of clueless, okay? That they don't do this with any kind of bad intentions. But what happened in the case of Frida? Well, the writer Gideon Alenkar says that she made so much noise, she had to be silenced. And in her case, we're talking about the silence of the official history. Even though she, among writing articles and Bible studies and editing a magazine, was also a hymn writer and a poet. And she even theologically developed a basis for women to have full participation in the ministry, and in practice was involved in every kind of church activity which was later prohibited to women. Nevertheless, she had to be silenced. And this has happened in the writing of the history, where if you read the official histories, you barely see her face. But it also happened in a very real way in the historical setting. And that is, well, he also points out there's a parallel between the assemblies in this country, who also had a lot of feminine participation early on, and then later that began to be marginalized. He points out that her official title, or what she was known as, I guess, in the Swedish language, was, I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's a Swedish word which means a professor of Bible teacher in Portuguese. And she was, he notes, the only woman who was actually writing commentaries as early as 1923. Well, her son later noted that she had the gift of teaching and preaching like nobody, but because of this, she really suffered. And here's the story. As she began to have more and more influence as a woman and began to defend and support women who were doing pastoral types of ministry. And remember, at this time, when the movement started, women were doing these kinds of things, and it just seemed normal. And here's the other thing that, as missionaries, that we noticed, which is really critical. We noticed that amongst a lot of our Brazilian friends and colleagues, there was more of an attitude that it's normal for women to do a lot of stuff because they saw the missionary women doing it. Now, that's a key thing. When I was appointed as a missionary, and we were at our appointment service in Richmond, and as the conservative takeover was happening in the convention, and I am theologically conservative, by the way, but I was told by one of the board members of the International Mission Board that he said, boy, when we read your statement on inerrancy in your doctrinal thing, we were really thrilled about sending you because there's a lot of liberalism down there. They've even got women preachers, and we want to send people who are going to stamp that out. And I just kind of smiled and nodded my head and said, yeah, well, yeah, that's... And so there's the recognition that women have had this nefarious influence just by their example, not even by their teaching. Well, by 1930, Frida was becoming a real problem for the good old boys. And so several of the male leaders in the church, and the church was not even well organized, and they said, well, we need to have a convention of representatives from all the churches to deal with some pressing issues that are a threat, as I said, to the progress and harmony of the cause of the Lord. Why? Well, we need a general convention so that we can remove certain obstacles that can embarrass the cause of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so in this convention, which they called General Convention in 1930, and since a lot of these missionaries were Swedish, they wanted to address four things: conflict between Brazilians and Swedish missionaries, conflict between the churches in the north and the south and the southeast. And remember, they had founded churches in the northern part of the country. In the south, more traditional missionaries were there first. So a lot of the assemblies were highly influenced by those who had been there for a while, and there was a lot less tolerance for women's ministry. And also to deal with the problem of two magazines that were being published. Okay, so this begins to hone in on what's the issue. And then the fourth question that had to be dealt with was the work of women in the church. And of course, the writer notes that actually the fourth issue was the only issue, and all these other ones are, kind of subpoints of that. And so their determination was women have the right to participate in all evangelical work, giving their testimonies, in teaching when it's necessary. But we don't consider it right for a woman to have the function of a pastor or teacher, except in exceptional cases mentioned in Matthew 12. In other words, if there's not a man around to do it, then we can grudgingly let a woman do the job. Only when there aren't any men who are capable of pastoring or teaching. So the author notes something interesting here. It reminds me of something that one of my history professors said years and years ago. If you want to find out what people are doing in a particular society, look at the laws and see what's against the law, because you don't make laws against stuff if people aren't doing it. So why would you prohibit women from pastoring and preaching? Well, because there are a bunch of women out there already doing it. And you've got to shut this stuff down because it's a threat to the harmony and peace and the cause of the gospel and whatever else. And so beginning in 1930, women began to as the writer says, suffer restrictions. And this was really a serious reaction. And so the marginalization, and I would say the erasure of women from history, would be intentional, not simply some oversight that happened. Now, Frida was not the kind of woman who would just sit back and take this, and so essentially she published in the magazine series of articles, excuse me, I'm reading this out in Portuguese, and the temptation is to say it in Portuguese. She declared war on the good old boys, and she was not going to take this sitting down. Well, in order to try to make some kind of peace, the convention decided, well, the main critic who stirred up this whole question of trying to get the women in their place, and I won't mention his name, but they said, well, we'll make the two of you co-editors of the magazine. Now, that was really silly because they lived, 3,000 miles apart on opposite sides of the country, and there was no internet. And effectively, this allowed Frida to keep control of it, but now she's under the covering of a man, and which would make it more legitimate. On the other hand, she still wouldn't shut up. And so she continues publishing and arguing in favor of women. Well, unfortunately, by a couple of years after this, in the early 30s, her husband's health deteriorated to the point that they had to return to Sweden. And so they went back to Sweden, and after a couple of years, he passed away. And she determined that she was going to go back to Brazil, but then discovered that the Swedish Mission Board would not send her back as a single mother. And so then she determined that she was going to go anyway, and if she couldn't, she get funding from the church, maybe individuals, or she was just going to go. Now, I don't have the details. He doesn't give up the details of exactly what happened next took place. Suffice it to say that the people around her, perhaps family members and church, thought that this idea was so deranged that they had her literally committed to an insane asylum. I wouldn't call it a psychiatric hospital back in those days, where they say she rapidly deteriorated and she died there 3 years later. And I don't know what to say about this other than it's a very clear implication, not just that this is not biblical for a woman to do this, but that it's actually insane, that it's crazy. And you are crazy for thinking that you can do it, and crazy to the point that we have to commit you and protect yourself from it. My wife, Kathy's a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she's worked in mental institutions, and I don't know how you would evaluate something like this as a basis for locking somebody away and putting them in a straitjacket. But this is the reality that existed. And that really raises some serious questions. And now we're beginning to run out of time. So I want to rapidly raise the question of, okay, well, what do we do about this kind of thing? And how is that relevant today? Well, they're not locking women up, as far as I know, who want to do ministry. But we were with the IMB at the time that they decided to go full bore into complementarianism. And among other reasons, that was a factor in our leaving. We tried to hang on for a while, but there were other issues as well that just made it not feasible. And today, I think the Southern Baptist Convention is dealing with some very serious, refusing to deal with some very serious issues related to this whole question. But one of the issues is, how do we deal with this? And we've had to face this in terms of our influence amongst Brazilians, many of whom are good friends, but who are complementarian, and maintaining good open relationships while not compromising our position. Now, I've interestingly found that a lot easier to do with Brazilian complementarians than I have with American complementarians. And so that's just an interesting little side fact there. But I think, first of all, there are two different lines of thought that I would take here. First of all, I just think that the time has come where, with women who are going to the field now, we need to direct them towards agencies that are openly affirming of their egalitarianism. Now, I want to add something to that, though. I think that should be done in the context of, and this organization, biblical equality. Amongst Brazilians, the evangelicals, and Brazilian Baptists, there have been a number who have argued for women's full participation, but who have done so apart here, from the standpoint that, maybe Paul got it wrong. Okay, now, that's not an option for us. Our position is, if the Bible teaches it, then we're obligated to believe it and practice it. And so we need to take a very strong stand as missions agencies, and if we're working, particularly in theological education, in defending the authority of Scripture and the veracity of Scripture. But on the other hand, we also need to direct women into context where they are just simply not going to have to put up with a lot of the garbage that has been. They're going to run into it anyway, but at least have institutional support in their mission agency. The other thing is that there was an interesting book that I also came across that talks about, and this is called Women in the Mission of the Church. Leanne Zubinski and Anneke Stassen, this is by Baker, came out a couple years ago. And in this particular book, which is a really good study of women in leadership and missions and a lot of the issues that they face, but one of the things that they talk about is what kind of support that women get from men that enable them to be successful. So specifically speaking of husbands, but I think this could be applied in a larger way. And that is, they said that universally, the women who really were successful and were happy, when they were doing their research and they interviewed dozens and dozens of women missionaries in leadership positions, and they asked them, well, tell us about your husband. And they said, they all were married to the same guy. Their description of the men was pretty much the same, which the authors of this study said is kind of remarkable because they knew some of these men personally, and they were very different, in their personalities and so forth. But there was a common core of how they interacted with their wives in their relationship, and particularly in how they interacted with their wives in relation to their ministries. And And so they give kind of a typology, and I just want to read this off to you. First of all, none of these men, none of these husbands were focused primarily on their own comfort. And then number two, they were not looking at their relationship with their wives as a competition. Which leads to number three, they didn't feel threatened by her success. And so as we get to the fourth point, because of that, they were completely supportive, and they encouraged her to grow to her full potential. And then finally, each of these guys seemed to take genuine joy in his wife's accomplishments. Now, as I was reading this, it was really kind of funny because we have a lot of missionary friends who are still full-time on the field. And one couple in particular that, and I love these guys to death, even though the guy is a hardcore complementarian. He's a seminary professor. If he's here listening to this, he knows I'm talking about him right now. And I think he's a great guy, and he's done a lot of very positive things in theological education and ministry in Brazil. His wife has an amazing ministry that stretches across the entire country. I won't go into a lot of details about it. It involves children and education of children, and she pretty much started this thing, and it's just snowballed. And the thing that really impressed me about it is because theologically, this couple is very complementarian, but she has a very successful ministry. And what really impressed me was that her husband, in talking about this, he's bragging about it. And he's bragging about her. And, like Proverbs 31, where you see the husband talking about. And this is the kind of relationship they had. And we've often mentioned, if you're listening, brother, that we've felt like that, the relationship is much more egalitarian than it is complementarian. Be that as it may disagree or not, but it fits this pattern. And interestingly enough, there are men who profess an egalitarian theology, but they don't particularly behave in this way. I hope I'm not getting in trouble over here. I try, dear, I do, but I know I'm not always consistent. But this is a model not only for husbands, but for men in general. And I remember something that Becky Groteis said many years ago, and that is, women in ministry, egalitarians, need men, and not in a way of, they can't do ministry or they're dependents, but they need their husbands, they need the men around them to put up a fight, to be the offensive line against a lot of the attacks that come from the other side, to be blocking this stuff and making a way, so they can run for the touchdown. I don't know if I should be using football imagery for this conversation, but I'm getting anxious because it's already been several months since football was on TV, and that's, I start getting the DTs here. But a model for how men can behave in such a way as to empower women to be able to be successful. And I know most of you here are women, but I really am speaking as a man to men about what we need to do. Is not really my place or my competency to tell women what they should do to be their best or most successful. But if we can get, first of all, our heads out of the sand and not be focused inwardly on our own comfort, really don't look at your wife's success as a competition. That's another thing. It's helpful to have a wife who is a specialist in a completely different area. It's less of a temptation. But even if both of you happen to be theology teachers or pastors or whatever, you're not there to compete. You're not there to win a contest. And therefore, if you are confident in your own walk with the Lord and what God has called you to do in the ministry you're doing, there's no reason for you to feel threatened by somebody else's success, particularly not your spouse's. And then, of course, as spouses, one of our main jobs is to encourage our partner to grow into their full potential. And we had that put into our wedding vows, and she posted it on the wall in our bedrooms. I have to look at it every day. I can't forget it, which I need. I will help you to become the best that you can be, to grow in the Lord and become fully what God has called you to be, by way of encouragement. And then, and I love this part, taking joy in your partner's accomplishments. You brag about them. And I am sick to death. Hearing men, particularly in a conversation, talk badly about their wives or in a critical way, that's pretty low stuff. And that undermines probably as much or more than anything. So in doing this, I think that we can at least pave a way for overcoming some of these barriers of, if we can model exposing, that is, revealing through telling the whole story, what women do on the mission field, rejoice in it, brag about it, maybe that can change attitudes about what they can do here. And I think that's kind of the place we started and where we finished up. So we're out of time. If anybody wants to make a comment or question or discuss, I think I ran a little longer than I intended to. But I am interested for the ladies here. Does any of this resonate with your experience, or did I kind of miss the... Okay. I hope I didn't, misrepresent or mislead in any way, but based on stuff that I've been researching and a lot of my own experiences, is kind of what I've observed. And yeah. Not being in competition with the wife. And therefore, number 3, not being threatened by her success. And then being wholly supportive, and this is not just of her ministry, but of her as a person, as a believer, to grow into her full potential. And then the last one is to take genuine joy in her accomplishments. And I add to that what the writers of this book did not say, but I think part of that is, you brag about them. I mean, you tell their story yourself as a husband or as a man. If you're a mission executive or administrator and you've got women that are working in your organization, when you tell the story to potential donors, you brag about what they're doing and you set them up as models and examples. And I think, for someone, whether you're a man or a woman, to kind of hear through the grapevine, oh, somebody that's close to you is out there bragging about how great you are. I mean, that's a supercharged shot of energy to say, yeah, somebody sees me, and I can keep going and keep doing this. And do that for your children, by the way. That's probably one of the most important things you can do for a child. Okay, yes. The book is Women in the Mission of the Church, Opportunities and Obstacles Throughout Christian History. And this is Leanne Zubinski. It's Dzubinski. Yeah, but it's Baker. And that book is a 2001 publication, so this is really recent. And essentially, it's a sociological study of women in mission leadership, where they've done a lot of ethnography of interviewing, and it's a pretty deep dive and a really well done study. So I think it's something that provokes a lot of thought and speaks to the needs that women have, learning from those who have gone before. Okay, well, I think it's lunchtime, so we will break. Thank you all very much.